Continuing with Gregory Brandt's best-selling book, this is chapter 3, Working Homeless. I lived out of my truck when I got back to San Antonio, usually parking it behind a church after it got dark. One of the most stressful things you can do when you're living in a car is to drive around trying to find somewhere to park, especially when you're drunk. Everybody needs somewhere to go back to at night, a spot. It could be an empty parking lot, a friend's backyard, or $1 million mansion. The mind needs a place to relax. I've always felt safe at churches, and you avoid cops and criminals. They're the ones you gotta look out for. Them and snitches. My sunburn got better within a week, and 1999 was an unseasonably mild summer by Texas standards. I was homeless and unemployed, staying up all night smoking weed with my friends and scrounging up enough pocket money for gas and cigarettes. I slept in the bed of my truck, stared at the stars, peeled dead skin off my back, and listened to Buddy Holly on the AM Oldies radio station on my truck's factory radio. During June, I lived off stolen change from Michael's car and ate food I took from Mom's friends when Guy wasn't home. A few days after the 4th of July, I got a day job working at an upscale hamburger joint, Chester's Hamburgers. Benny also helped me get a second gig washing dishes at the Little Caesars pizza place where he worked. I was still sleeping in my truck behind the church, but at least I had 2 jobs. Each job was totally different with 2 unalike sets of employees on opposite sides of the social spectrum. The people at Little Caesars were cool, laid back, and easy to get along with. They worked to pay their bills. They worked because they had to. The kids at Chester's were aloof, stuck up, and treated individuals they considered inferior without respect. They worked because their parents suggested it. I hated working at Chester's, but Little Caesars had an environment I could relate to. The employees weren't working summer jobs like the kids at Chester's referred to them as. It was the middle of summer, but the people at Little Caesars wouldn't have called it a summer job. My shift at Chester's was from 8 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. When I was done flipping burgers, I had a short break before I had to be at Little Caesars. I was their only dishwasher, so my evenings were spent scrubbing dough off pizza pans. We'd wrap things up around midnight, and me, Benny, and the crew would head over to the manager's house to drink Bud Light, smoke Schweig blunts, and watch late-night MTV. If I was too drunk to drive, I'd usually sleep in my truck parked in front of my manager's house, but most nights I'd leave before the sun came up and drive to my favorite church parking lot. Waking up at sunrise and going to work at Chester's sucked, and I'm the first to admit that I didn't have a positive attitude toward my more fortunate coworkers. I usually had been drinking all night, and even though I didn't get hangovers back then, waking up covered in dirt, sweat, and mosquito bites in a rusty pickup truck would have put anyone in a bad mood. The worst part about it was not shitting or showering before I had to be cheerful at a greasy hamburger joint with people who treated me like shit. I wasn't happy, but I knew employment was the only way out. Working yourself out of homelessness is the most common way to beat it. According to a New York City census that was published on the website for the Coalition of the Homeless in 2010, about 44% of homeless in the United States have full-time jobs. The kids at Chester's knew each other from Churchill High School, one of the wealthiest schools in town. I'm pretty sure they didn't have many urgent bills to pay. They acted like I was invading their turf. With one look at my cheap shoes and rusty truck, they slapped a label on me. Labels prevent you from getting to know someone. You know the feeling you get when you walk in a room after a group of people have just been talking about you? I had that feeling every day at Chester's. The only part of my shift I enjoyed was when I went outside to wash the windows and doors with old newspapers. I'd take my time and read all the headlines while I polished the glass. It was the only time I didn't feel their stares and jokes. I've had over 100 jobs in my life, and most I left to my own recognizance, but Chester's one of the few places that I actually got fired from. I was upset when they told me, but it wasn't because I got fired. I hated that job. I was pissed because they fired me because I didn't fit in. Now that hurt my ego. It was much better with the crew at Little Caesars. They were from a working class background and didn't drive cars their parents bought them. They didn't analyze my cheap shoes like the kids at Chester's did. I'd hang out with the Little Caesars gang almost every night. We had food fights with the pizza toppings, gave our friends free pies, and smoked pot and drank beer in the walk-in freezer. By the time September came, I had saved up enough for an apartment. I was ready to get out of my truck, but I still needed a cosigner. This took some persuading, but I managed to convince Mom to convince Guy to let her co-sign for me to get an apartment. I promised her I'd have the rent paid on time every month, but I knew it was going to be tough. The apartment was a few streets down from where Michael and I grew up. It was my first real place, but I never got comfortable. It felt like I was house sitting. Everyone I knew said it'd be a matter of time before I got kicked out. It was like I didn't deserve it, and my friends at the time only reinforced that idea. Knowing you, they'd always say. I enjoyed entertaining company in my new place. It felt like it did in Jonathan's garage. Michael had moved to our sister's duplex in Austin, but he'd still make the drive to San Antonio a couple times a week to stay at my place. We had our 20th birthday party there. I was drunk, high on cocaine, and tripping on acid all at the same time. The night started off slow with just a few losers hanging out in my living room, but then loads of people started to show up. Attractive blonde girls, friends with big bags of weed, and even a small motorcycle gang that lived down the street from Mom's house. My job at Little Caesars wasn't enough to cover rent, so Benny and I got a morning gig delivering newspapers in my truck. We were horrible carriers who broke windows, knocked over flower pots, and sent papers flying through wind chimes. You lose common sense delivering a newspaper, but some of the best times I ever had was throwing it. One Saturday night, my truck was having engine problems, so Benny asked his 80-year-old father to help us roll and deliver the big Sunday paper. We parked his red F-350 truck outside the balcony of my third-story apartment and threw papers over the ledge into the bed. The three of us rolled Sunday papers early into the morning while his dad told us spirited stories about the Great Depression, World War II, and being born during the Woodrow and Wilson administration. My apartment manager got a bunch of late night calls from neighbors complaining. I was already in hot water due to my birthday party a few weeks earlier, and it felt like I'd be kicked out any day, just like my friends had predicted. By the time December came, I still hadn't been kicked out, but I couldn't stand living there anymore. Something didn't feel right. I was working two jobs and trying to keep up with what society told me. I could do the same thing for years and have nothing to show for it. It wasn't me. A wise man once said, "There's no dignity in a man who works 8 hours a day, not knowing what he's working toward." The vibe in the air during the last moments of the 20th century was bizarre. Everywhere you went, people were pulling their hair out, gnawing off the stubs of their fingers, and screaming Bible verses on street corners. Media outlets were implying a worldwide impact from the Y2K virus, and hordes of TV watching suburbanites were stocking up on bottled water and canned food. One of our sisters was going to Las Vegas for the millennium, and she asked if I'd watch her duplex for a few days. I jumped at the chance and vowed to renounce the rat race. The next day, I emptied my apartment and dropped off all my furniture behind a Goodwill thrift store. I threw away just about everything I owned besides a few photographs, a couple journals, and a bunch of dog-eared paperbacks. It felt great being back in Austin, stomping around the drag. It was winter break and most students were back in their hometowns, but the drag rats were still milling up and down campus streets. I just read Hell's Angels by Hunter S. Thompson, and it inspired me to befriend as many of these gutter punks as I could. I planned to infiltrate the group of rebellious outcasts and find out more about the tribe of rebels. The homeless broods didn't accept me into their world at first. I was too clean cut. They thought I was a Trustafarian from the highbrow neighborhoods of Westlake or Tarrytown who got bored with his parents' money and decided to go slumming. When a few of them found out I was watching my sister's duplex for New Year's, their attitude changed and I began bringing home the dirtiest kids in town. They were so filthy it took about 5 minutes for them to wreck the joint. They got my sister's new living room set covered in dirt, made a mess in the kitchen, and tracked mud in with their fake Doc Martens. I didn't start kicking a few out until I found a used syringe in the toilet. A few of them stayed in the duplex leading up to the New Year, and on New Year's Eve they invited a group of their more unsavory friends to join the party. We needed food and supplies, so we took my truck to the new suburban H-E-B grocery store they just built. It was overflowing with chaos, packed with crazies stocking up on supplies. The drag rats took advantage of the disorder and filled their pockets with as much merchandise that fit. One of them walked out with a case of beer in each hand. Another hit up the meat department and stole hundreds of dollars worth of steaks. The only drag rat who refused to shoplift was a 16-year-old runaway named Autumn. Autumn was from a hardcore Christian town in East Texas. She moved to Austin to escape a sexually abusive stepfather and ended up downtown where the drag rats ate her alive. I felt bad for her. She hadn't become a drug addict until the drag rats turned her into a prostitute. There wasn't much I could do besides letting her know that there were people in this world who wouldn't hurt her. A little after midnight, someone busted out some purple microdot and we tripped acid in my sister's backyard until the sun came up. Everyone felt like they'd known each other for years and everything was simple and clear. LSD will do that to you. It reveals all the mystical patterns of the universe, but by the time the sun comes up, your enlightened thoughts slip away, unnoticed. Before the Rose Bowl kicked off, I'd gotten rid of the last of the drag rats from the duplex. My sister was due home that evening, and the place was a mess, so I spent the next few hours cleaning up. I did it half-assed with a smirk on my face, knowing that I couldn't get out every stain and had no explanation for anything missing. My sister got back that night, took one look at the duplex our father bought her, and told me to leave. I didn't have money or anywhere to go, but I had half a tank of gas, so I figured my best option was to drive to the day labor place on the other end of town and wait for them to open. I parked behind the strip mall, climbed in the bed of my truck, and went to sleep under the stars. There was a few other people sleeping in their vehicles waiting for the place to open too, but that's not an occasion where you yell out, "Howdy!" The next day I woke up before dawn and got in line with all the other have-nots at the labor hall. I was the youngest guy there, but I had a truck, so I only had to wait a couple hours before I got sent on a job with a Latino named Raul. Raul didn't speak much English, but he was polite and supplied me with cigarettes. I shared my lunch with him. When we finished, Raul asked me for a ride to his motel. While I was driving him, he noticed a problem with my truck. He said it was the fuel filter and offered to help fix it over some beer at his place. On the way there, I stopped at a Walmart for the car part and a case of Bud Light. Raul was staying at the kind of motel you see with tiny cabins you drive right up to and park outside. Most don't have paved lots, just dirt and gravel. You see a lot of cab drivers settle for these kind of rooms, but it's got to be the bottom of the barrel as far as sleeping inside goes. My experience with these places is that some look bad from the outside, but they can be quite accommodating when you get through the door. This was not one of those places. Raul's room smelled like unclean bodies and half-burnt cigarettes. There wasn't any carpet, only broken tiles and a layer of dust. He turned on the TV and told me to wait. I sat on his mattress, which was on the floor, and watched an hour of Spanish television. For a moment, I told myself things were going okay. I was getting by and felt resilient. I even considered staying at the motel with my new friend Raul. He suggested it when we first arrived, saying me, him, and my Chevy truck would be the three amigos. Plans changed when Raul came back and busted out two things I didn't want to see. The first was a loaded crack pipe. I could have gotten past his drug use and might have even taken part, but then he whipped out his penis and I went running. He didn't just briefly expose himself, but he pulled out his crooked brown schlong and started swinging around the room like he was about to strike a piñata. I got in my truck and raced down I-35 back to San Antonio. I didn't want to run into Raul at the labor hall, and I didn't want to see any drag rats I'd hung out with on New Year's Eve. Neither would ever help me get any closer to achieving my goal of graduating from UT. Going back to San Antonio felt logical. I figured I'd have a better chance of finding a couch to sleep on there than I did in Austin. I heard Benny and Michael had gotten a one-bedroom apartment on the north side. I hadn't spoken to either of them in about a month, but I thought I'd stop by with some strong acid as a peace offering. It wasn't hard to find their new place. They moved into an infamous set of apartments the three of us used to terrorize years earlier when we were selling newspaper subscriptions door to door. Now they were residents there. They were happy to see me, and after a night of psychedelics, asked if I wanted to live there full-time and pay rent. There were three of us in a one-bedroom apartment, and each of us had a cat. The first night I brought my cat, Polly, over. Benny's cat, Mr. Anderson, impregnated her. In a month, the apartment had 3 cats, 3 bachelors, and a gang of kittens climbing the walls. It was a matter of time before things blew up. When it was just me and Michael, we talked trash about Benny. When it was just Benny and me, we talked smack about Michael. The cats didn't get along either. Their actions mirrored their owners, always hissing and clawing at each other. The apartment was in Benny's name, but I didn't think he'd kick me out. I was paying rent and we were friends. We weren't getting along, but we had known each other for years. So I was surprised when I came home from day labor one day and found he'd changed the locks and threw me and Michael's stuff in the bed of my truck. He decided to kick me, Michael, and our cats out so he could have a new friend move in. It wouldn't have been so bad, but Benny locked my cat out with her kitten still inside the apartment. They needed milk and were crying through the locked door. I was furious and started screaming for the neighbors' help, storming around the complex with my fists clenched. Polly was meowing like crazy, and I was yelling for God like a lunatic. When it got dark, I sat in my truck outside the apartment and waited for Benny. At midnight, it began to rain, and everything I owned got soaked. I didn't care. I was too upset about my inability to be a good owner to my pet. In the middle of the night, Polly crawled in my truck and cozied up next to me like she finally understood. I woke up the next day, but there was still no sight of Benny, so I stormed to the apartment manager's office and begged her to open the door. She said she'd normally open it with her extra key, but Benny had put my name on the lease and he changed the locks anyways. I called Mom, but she was at work, so she called one of our sisters. Our sisters weren't very nice to us growing up, so as adults, they tried to do the occasional act of kindness. I imagine they might throw us a piece of kebab if they ever spotted us starving in India, if no one was looking, of course. When our sister got there, she immediately began bitching out the manager and threatened to call the Humane Society. The manager called the locksmith, and 15 minutes later, the door was open. Each kitten grabbed a nipple and commenced suckling. Mom got there after work and took Polly and her kittens back to Guy's house. She brought them with her to the school she worked at until she found each a home. I hadn't been driving my truck since I moved in with Benny. I was giving it a break and hadn't even tried to start it in a few weeks. I didn't try to start it that night either. I wasn't going anywhere until Polly was back together with her kittens, anyways. But after I finally had that taken care of, I tried to start it and realized it wouldn't turn over. I had nowhere to go, so I took the bus to Mom's house and slept in the backyard with their smelly dog, Elmo. Early the next morning, I walked a few miles to the day labor place, but work was scarce. By lunchtime, I realized these places weren't ever gonna get me anywhere, and I needed something more permanent. Benny had told me about a telemarketing gig downtown that hired anyone on the spot. Most people quit the same day, he said. Lucky ones get out after their first check. He said the worst part about the place was this greedy, football crazy manager who'd bully old ladies till they cried. The job was selling newspaper subscriptions over the phone. I knew I'd be good at it, but the fat boss didn't agree. During my interview, he said I had no experience selling over the phone and didn't think I was cut out for it. I felt insulted and told him I sold newspaper subscriptions door to door for 4 years and I broke all the sales records. The fat boss laughed and said, "Selling subscriptions over the phone is way different than selling them door to door. And I'm sorry, but Greg, you just don't seem like the enthusiastic type." I convinced him to let me start off part-time by telling him to come in with a positive attitude and plenty of pep. He rolled his eyes and said he'd give me a week to see if I could keep up with the other schmucks. I was going to do this telemarketing thing my way with a laid-back style that's foreign to the telemarketing world. It doesn't work for everyone or anyone for that matter, so I get why he wanted me to be more upbeat. But I'm an enigma you can't put in a corner or slap a label on. The boss and his cronies didn't like me when I first walked in, but by the end of the week I'd become the top seller, made them the most money, and was their new favorite employee. The hardest part about being homeless at a new job is waiting for your first paycheck. This particular battle wasn't that bad because the weather was mild and I was crashing in the broken down Lincoln parked in Mom's driveway. The car had been busted there for years. It was the same one she used to take us to Dairy Queen's for blizzards in on Wednesday afternoons. I had fond memories in it, but I never thought I'd be sleeping in it. I knew the doors didn't lock. Michael and I broke them when we were 10. I'd get off of work at night and have a long bus ride across town to Mom's driveway. It was better than her backyard, and by the time I got there, the neighborhood was dead. Mom lived in a blue-collar area, and blue-collar workers have to get up earlier than their white counterparts. I'd spend my nights hanging out in the back seat of the Lincoln, listening to music, playing guitar, smoking pot, and talking to myself without notice. When morning came and everyone started going to their jobs, I'd be careful and crouch down so no one could see me. Mom and Guy would leave early along with the rest of the neighborhood, and then I'd break inside and kick back on their piece of shit couch for a couple hours before going to my soul-sucking sales job. I was wasting my time in academic ambitions. There's only so much you can learn in a telemarketing office. I had a thirst for knowledge, but my days were consumed with calling strangers and pretending I lived down the street just so I could sell them an insignificant newspaper subscription for a paper I've never read about in a city I've never been to. The first week I slept in the Lincoln was spring break. I couldn't believe where I had ended up and told myself I should be in college. I laid in the back seat and put myself in a sleep by imagining myself as a UT student. I get stoned and picture myself on campus, taking tests, doing homework, and studying in the library. As soon as I got my first paycheck and first day off, I headed toward my busted truck. When I got to the bus stop, I saw a familiar face. It was an old crackhead I knew from Tona's house named Brewster. He was about 35, which was old to me at the time. Brewster had druggie written all over his premature wrinkles and gray hair. It was the first time I ever saw him without his trademark beat-up Chevy truck. Both of us had old Chevys, and that was about the only thing we had in common. I remember always seeing him in Tona's driveway working on his truck, tinkering with this or that. The guy may have been a drug addict, but he did know how to work on old trucks. I couldn't have run into a person more suited to help. We chatted it up at the bus stop, and Brewster was cool, but when we got on the city bus, he started sweating and looking around like he didn't want to be recognized. He said he felt embarrassed about using public transportation, but I was thinking he should have been more ashamed of the missing teeth and his obvious crack habit. Speaking of crack addicts, that's what you hear in the background. Brewster said he was on his way to visit a friend about loaning him some money for dope. It was obvious he needed a fix. I told him I was on my way to Benny's old apartment for my truck, and if he helped me fix it, then I'd buy him some drugs. A fix for a fix, I lamely said. Brewster was Tona's boyfriend. She was married to Harry, but Brewster was her main squeeze. Despite none of them getting along with one another, they'd smoke crack and shoot up in the back room almost every night. Brewster and Harry hated each other, but they actually had a lot in common. They were both in a sexual relationship with the same woman, they both smoked crack, and they were both perverts. Cocaine turns you into a sexual deviant, making you do things you normally wouldn't even consider. There were always rumors about anal sex threesomes between Harry, Brewster, and Tona. Plenty of crackheads went to her house, but Brewster basically lived there. A couple years had passed since I last saw Brewster, and both of us had long since stopped talking to Tona. I didn't think I'd ever see this weirdo again, but fate had us sitting on a city bus together. I told him about my homeless situation and how Benny kicked me out. I could tell he didn't care, but at least he pretended like he was interested. Brewster didn't miss his truck for transportation. He missed it because of what he used it for, driving behind businesses to steal their wooden pallets and plastic storage containers. This is what supported his habits. He'd wait till nobody was looking, then fill the back of his truck until it was overflowing with pallets. He sold the loot to different various warehouses on the outskirts of town. They'd give him about $100 per truckload before cleaning up the pallets and selling them back to the exact same stores. I didn't want to associate with this guy, but I knew it was in my best interest until I got my truck running. The downside was that there was a good chance he'd eventually get cracked out of his mind and resort to violence. If I was going to spend any time around this freak, then I needed a set escape route and be ready to jump the second things got weird. Brewster's scam of robbing businesses for their pallets had been paying for his booze and crack for years, but now that he didn't have a truck, he lost his livelihood. The fiend craved his old life back, debating if he should start sucking dick for crack. My Chevy was almost identical to the one that he previously had, so he thought if he helped me fix it, he wouldn't have to resort to giving sweaty truck drivers blowjobs. Of course, this wasn't the case. I'd greatly appreciate any help he gave me, but I knew the most important thing was to keep my telemarketing job, find somewhere else to live, and never talk to this junkie again. We got off the bus about a block from Benny's apartment and walked to my truck. It took Brewster less than 5 minutes to take off the improperly installed fuel filter, blow into it to get it unclogged, and then put it back in correctly. The truck started up right away, and I drove us to his apartment where we drank a few beers while he explained the ins and outs of the pallet stealing business. I'd been to Brewster's apartment a few years earlier with Tona and a girl I was dating at the time. Tona and him smoked crack in the bedroom while me and my girlfriend smoked pot and cigarettes in the living room. His place smelled like a casino and was decorated like a jail cell, but it had a big couch and an old school black and white TV that I liked. After it got dark, I drove Brewster around the east side while he stole pallets and plastic storage containers. We'd usually hit chain drugstores and supermarkets. We'd fill up the back of my truck and in a few minutes be stocked up with over $100 of overlooked valuables. I did this with Brewster for about a week, selling pallets to shady factories on the outskirts of town. Brewster would have me wait in the truck while he got our money. He hardly ever gave me a cut or even told me how much we made. He'd always say he'd see how much was left after we bought drugs, but there was never any left. It didn't take long to realize that I needed to ditch him the first chance I got. I may have been homeless, but I wasn't a crackhead's bitch. I never bought drugs on the street like Brewster did. I'd usually just go through someone I knew or a friend of a friend. But Brewster would just drive around the east side until he saw a black guy standing on a corner. When I took him to buy drugs, the dealers would usually come to the driver's side window, and Brewster would have to signal them to the passenger side. I never let Brewster drive no matter how many times he asked. I was young, but I knew what kind of person I was dealing with. After we scored the crack, we went back to his apartment, and he'd get high while I'd keep him company, smoking weed and telling stories. By the third night, I started to wonder how this guy kept a roof over his head, so when the time was right, I asked him straight up, and he told me his stepdad owned the entire complex and let him stay for free. He didn't pay rent, and he'd been living like that for 15 years. I wouldn't have guessed Brewster still lived off his parents. One night, he was tearing up his apartment, searching for a piece of steel wool. I was half-assed helping him when I came across an old Polaroid picture on the bottom of the shoebox. The pic was from the 1970s with a handsome blonde kid gleaming in front of a new Firebird. "Who's that?" I asked, pointing to the picture. "It's me," he defensively said. "Wow, that's you?" I asked, surprisingly. "Yes, that is me." The tone he used suggested that he took offense. "It was 20 years ago," he added. "You look way different," I told him. "How'd you afford the car?" Brewster's facial expression turned along with the mood of the room. He didn't answer my question. He sadly looked at his broken down reflection in the picture frame. He was only a shell of the man he used to be. The photograph said a million words. It showed me how drugs can change who a person is and even how they physically appear. He threw the photo down and said if I wanted to stay there, then I had to smoke crack. I tried to reason with him, insisting it wasn't my thing. I told him I'd grind it up and snort it instead. It took some convincing, but he eventually agreed to let me snort tiny piles of crack. I refused to willingly smoke crack, at least not at this point in my life. Brewster had nothing on me. My truck was fixed and I didn't need him. He needed me, and more importantly, he needed my truck. Dude would have done anything to keep me there, but there was no way. After a few nights of snorting crack piles, I finally had enough and planned an escape. I was going to wait for the freak to get high while I stayed sober and slipped out the back door. At dusk, we drove to the east side to get the daily crack ration, but when we got back, I told Brewster I didn't feel like taking part in that night's festivities. The junkie flipped out and started marching around his apartment with his fists clenched. I was ready to fight him if that's what it came to, but instead he stormed out and said he was gonna go grab a whore. It was the first time Brewster left me alone in this place. He didn't trust me because when a thief looks in the mirror, they see a thief, and they automatically assume everyone else is a thief just like them. Less than a minute after he left, I realized I had no business staying there. I didn't have anywhere else to go, but it'd be stupid to surround myself with someone like him any longer than I had to. Brewster got back an hour later with a gray-haired hooker. She was about 50 and looked like somebody's grandmother. I felt sorry for her. She was sadder than a used package of ramen noodles stuck in a storm drain. They smoked crack in the bathroom before Brewster brought her back in the living room and sat her next to me on the couch. Then he tried to belittle me in front of her, standing over us and proclaiming, "Look, he's scared to smoke. He grinds it up like a baby." "No, I'm not scared," I told the woman. "I've done coke before, but I have to be at work very early tomorrow." She looked at me with confused eyes, then she looked at the floor in shame and kicked her shoes together like a toddler. "I had a job once, a long time ago," she pathetically said. Brewster tried to lighten the room by putting on some shitty 1980s hairband that nobody had ever heard of. He showed the prostitute the picture of him and his Firebird. She acted impressed. Then they went into the bedroom, and I stretched out on the couch and pretended like I was falling asleep. I kept my eyes closed until I heard the sound of bumping uglies. That was my cue. I crept out the front door and slipped inside my truck, but when Brewster heard the familiar truck engine start, he ran outside naked and tried to chase me down. I peeled out of his crummy apartment complex while he desperately tried to grab the truck bumper. I turned on my AM radio and laughed. The last sight I ever had of Brewster was through my rearview mirror, running as fast as he could, naked, crying, and high on crack cocaine. It was great to have my truck back in commission. I had a vehicle and a full-time job, so it wouldn't be long before I had somewhere to live. I still had to sleep in my truck, but at least I could get around easier compared to with taking the bus. Michael was living at Mom's house again, so when Guy wasn't home, I could shit, shower, and grab something to eat. I made a gang of friends at my telemarketing job, and management loved me. After a few weeks, I was the top salesperson. I was always on time and sold more newspaper subscriptions than anyone. At one point, they introduced an Employee of the Month award and gave it to me for 3 months straight before I finally told them to honor someone else. Most of my coworkers knew I was looking for a place to live, and one day I was introduced to a tough little Mexican from Houston named Joby. Joby reminded me of Latino James Cagney. He was who he was and didn't try to impress anyone. Sometimes he was a few minutes late, and you could tell he just got out of bed. The manager would always get on his ass for it because apparently he lived 2 blocks away. Everyone would see Joby slowly walking to work, staring at his shoes with a scowl on his face before the shift. Coworkers turned their heads and looked quickly as they drove by, trying not to be late themselves. I admired his attitude because people are usually phonies when they get to work. One night after our shift, Joby invited me to see his apartment. I knew I probably had a place to stay. I didn't know him personally, but that's how life works. A stranger will give you a ride, someone will buy you lunch, or you move in with someone you never met before. Everything you think that's set in stone can change in an instant. Joby lived a few blocks from the telemarketing office in the San Antonio College section of town. People in San Antonio call it the SAC district. It's a poor area where most students who go to San Antonio College don't live anywhere near. Their student body consists of underachieving slackers from the suburbs of the affluent north side. The SAC area is the gay bar part of San Antonio, and there's a homo tavern on every corner. You can't go more than 2 blocks without being propositioned by a sickly-looking transvestite or harassed for change by a scab-covered junkie. It's a good place for a young writer because the fringe of society is where you find the best stories. A few college students lived in the neighborhood, but most houses were chock full of addicts and welfare families. The few college kids I met around there were from the same suburbs as their north side peers, but they were a little cooler, drawn to the ghetto and its urban facade. It was the poorest neighborhood I have ever been in. Every building was an ancient rotting dwelling in dire need of repair. They called it historic, but to me it was just old wood and disease-carrying rats. Just by driving through, you could smell the urine-stained sidewalks and burnt crack without even rolling down your car window. After our shift, me and Joby walked to his apartment. I wasn't expecting much, but it was worse than that. The oddly shaped unit was empty besides random slapdash crap Joby had grabbed from street corners. It looked like the house from Fight Club, with metal pipes slowly dripping water, very little light, and bloodstains covering the walls and carpet. The place would have smelled bad enough, but the stench was made worse by Joby's pet ferret, Stinky. The building was 3 stories and over 100 years old. It was built when San Antonio was a border town. Modern construction sliced the once spectacular home into separate, unusually sized rental units. Each apartment had its own peculiar floor plan with long hallways that don't go anywhere, uneven ceilings, and rooms of all different sizes. I hung around his house for a few hours, and some of his rowdy friends came over, so I slipped out his back door, sat on the porch, and lit up a Marlboro Red cigarette. A few minutes later, a super hot dreadlocked blonde with a dancer's body pulled up on a bicycle. I was surprised to see someone like her in such a ghetto-ass neighborhood, and I immediately knew she'd be an important person in my life. I never broke eye contact. I continued sitting exactly where I was on Joby's stoop, smiled, and politely said, "Hi, my name's Gregory," while extending my hand. The girl looked at me coldly, didn't smile, didn't shake my hand, didn't say a word, just picked up her bike with her toned biceps, lifted it over my head, and went up the stairs to her place. Joby heard the girl go upstairs, came outside, and looked at her ass. He did it like it was something he did every time she came home. "I'll move in tonight," I told him. The first thing we did was drive to the grocery store. Joby finally had someone to drive him to H-E-B in style. He'd gotten tired of lugging bags of potatoes and rice back on foot, but he said he didn't mind the walking part. "I'll walk at least a mile every day I'm alive." My first few nights there were shady because Joby would have freaks over to do drugs with until the sun came up. They were all cokeheads, and they convinced me to try this stuff. Even though most of Joby's friends and cousins were gay, they didn't fit the stereotype. They liked to drink in the neighborhood and go to Joby's for cocaine when the bars closed. One night, I woke up with a huge fruity brute on top of me ripping my clothes off. The last thing any straight man wants to come in contact with during the middle of the night is a bull queer high on crack. I fought him off during the altercation, but during the altercation, his friend, who was waiting in the car outside, came to assist his butt buddy. I found myself wrestling around a piss-stained carpet with 2 rapists high on crack. I felt like Andy in the Shawshank Redemption. I kept the monsters at bay for a few minutes until Joby woke up. He saw what was going on and gave the situation a look like he'd seen it before. Then he grabbed a baseball bat and started swinging at them. He didn't hit either of them and didn't look like he was really trying to, but they took off running out the back anyway. The screen door was left swinging, and my new roommate and I were left in awkward silence. "I'm not staying here if this happens again," I told him. Joby scolded me for not fighting back harder than I did. He said he was going to make me tough, like the streets of Houston. I wasn't interested in having the skills necessary to fight off aggressive homosexuals, and would rather not be put in that position to begin with. It was obvious this living situation was temporary, so I kept my eyes open for a way out. I wasn't going to gain much hanging around Joby and his gay friends. They weren't smart, nothing they said was clever, creative, or the least bit intelligent, and I found their lifestyle disgusting. I have a tendency to find the good in every situation. The best thing about moving in with Joby was the girl who lived upstairs. I found out her name was Lisa, and she hated Joby for the numerous catcalls he'd been giving her since the day her and her boyfriend moved in. I could tell by looking at her that she was a girl I'd like to be friends with. I put on a harder, less genuine facade with Joby's crowd. At first, Lisa only associated me with Joby and figured since I lived with him, I was a crack-smoking, crunk-listening goon from Houston like he was. But when she actually gave me a minute of her time, she quickly saw I wasn't anything like that. Lisa was a first-year college student who lived with her older boyfriend, Javier. Javier was a student too, but he'd been going to community college on his parents' money for years without earning enough credits for a degree or a transfer to a university. He'd always drop his classes right in the middle of the semester before grades came out. This prevented him from flunking out and kept his parents sending money. Javier had a nonchalant attitude towards school and his girlfriend. Neither was important, nothing to work for, just convenient. Lisa and Javier were always at an even keel. There weren't any highs or lows, and they never got in any fights. It was a far cry from an up and down roller coaster. It was far from an up and down roller coaster like most romances. They weren't indifferent, but Javier never got emotional and nothing got under his skin. He wasn't protective of Lisa and let her do what she wanted. Within a couple weeks, Lisa and I were hanging out and smoking weed every day. I didn't spend any time with Javier, but Lisa and I became quick friends. What made it stranger was that Javier wasn't threatened by our relationship and acting like he didn't care in the least. "As long as you're happy," he'd tell Lisa. Lisa had a bunch of friends, but Javier didn't hang out with any of them either. Lisa worked the cash register at a Greek restaurant a few blocks away. One day, she told me they were looking for a dishwasher, and I jumped at the chance to spend more time with my new friend. Working at a restaurant with Lisa sounded like a lot more fun than calling people to sell them a trivial newspaper subscription. With Lisa's recommendation, the Greek place hired me full time. We told the manager we wanted to work the same shifts, so now we were around each other all day. Even though the restaurant was only a mile away, I'd drive us and take us home in my truck. Lisa acted like she hated to be seen in my truck, but it's where we got to know each other. Some nights we drive around for hours listening to the oldies station on my AM radio and wondering what our lives would be like in the future. I told her if I hadn't become rich and famous by the time I turned 27, then I'd kill myself like my favorite rock stars. She playfully punched me. What? 27 is still young. It's old, I said. Javier is 27, she defensively said. Okay, I told her. I'll wait till I'm 30. Lisa and I tried to include Javier in our smoke sessions a couple times, but it was always felt weird. Sometimes she'd invite her best friend Elizabeth to the apartment and act like she was trying to hook the two of us up. The three of us would stay up late drinking and smoking. One day I was off from work and driving back to the apartment with a fat bag of weed for Lisa and me. I pulled up to the traffic light in front of Demos and saw Lisa busting a table through the window. I couldn't take my eyes off her nipples pressing through her skin-tight blue Demos shirt. I slowed down and waved like a jackass. She saw me from inside the store and waved back. I tried to give her the universal OK signal to let her know I scored the weed, but I lost concentration and gently bumped into the car sitting at the light in front of me. A tiny irate Mexican got out of a 1980s sedan. The backside of his car was a little dented and I tried to apologize, but the guy didn't speak any English besides curse words. Our lack of communication made things chaotic, with him running in circles while he mispronounced lines he previously heard in English-speaking action movies, and me apologizing in Spanish while I awkwardly bowed as if he was from Japan. Lo siento, señor. Lo siento, señor. I refused to get policia involved because I just picked up some pot and had traffic warrants all over town. I explained to the furious Mexican that I worked at the restaurant Allá and pointed to Demos. Lisa stopped busting the table and stared out the window, in shock. I told him I'd pay for everything, but insisted on not getting the authorities involved. But the man said he was calling La Policia. I wanted to talk this out, but he wouldn't listen to me. Finally, I gave him a Demos business card. I promised to pay for the damages, got in my truck, and took off before the cops got there. When I got home, I called Lisa at work and told her to look out the window and describe the scene. She said there was an angry Latino stomping up and down the pavement in front of Demos. He'd moved dented sedan off the street and into the parking lot. When the cops got there, they grabbed a Mexican busboy from the kitchen and took him outside to translate. I didn't know what to do, so I instinctively parked my truck under a highway underpass and covered it with branches and leaves. I had committed a felony, and I knew the most practical thing to do was to disguise my identity, cut off most ties, and start a new life on the lam. Infatuation makes people do things they normally wouldn't. I love spending time with Lisa, so the next day I went and got my truck and went back to work like the accident never happened. An hour into my shift, a cop came inside Demos during the lunch rush with the Mexican I crashed into. This cop spoke English and Spanish. The three of us argued in the restaurant's dining room like actors in a telenovela. The crowded Greek restaurant's diners stopped eating baklava long enough to gawk. It's not every day you see a cop and a fuming Mexican questioning an employee at your favorite lunch spot. Everyone stared with mouths half full of gyro like I was a criminal. I denied everything. There hadn't been any damage to my truck, so it was his word against mine. After 20 minutes of badgering me to confess, the officer told me to wait at the restaurant while he went back to the station to get his supervisor. As soon as they were out of sight, I told my boss I was leaving and not coming back. If I would have admitted to it, the cops could have charged me with a Class D felony. I didn't have money for a lawyer, and I knew damn well how the Texas Department of Criminal Justice works. I'd be chained to the system for years. Nobody wants to be classified as a felon for the rest of their life. I was young, but I was smart enough to listen to my gut. When Lisa got home, she called Elizabeth and asked Javier if he'd spend the night at his sister's house. The accident I was in was the main topic of conversation, and I enthusiastically spoke about the ordeal to the girls, displaying my storytelling ability. Lisa's friend Elizabeth was attractive, tall, and skinny with a figure good enough to be a weird-looking model. Raised in a fundamental Christian household, she had like 10 brothers and sisters. Girl had a desire to rebel, and she couldn't have met anyone more suited to help. The three of us got drunk and watched California, with a K. By the time the credits came on, Elizabeth and I planned a trip to California in her parents' station wagon. I told her I'd sell my truck and we could use the money I got on it for gas, food, and cigarettes and weed. Lisa got jealous and ran upstairs to call Javier while Elizabeth and I fell asleep, drunk. The next morning, Lisa snuck in through the back door and woke us up, saying, "I talked to Javier and I'm coming to California too." Lisa looked Elizabeth directly in the eye and waited for her to respond. The girl took an eternity to say something. "What about Javier?" Elizabeth finally asked. "Is he coming too?" "No, just me," Lisa said, "as long as you guys are cool with it." Elizabeth gave Lisa a look and said, "Sure, we'd love to have you." The next day, the three of us started making plans for the trip. I couldn't believe my luck. A couple months earlier, I was sleeping in a broken down car in Mom's driveway, and now I was going to California with two gorgeous teen girls. The weekend before we left, we took a drive to the water park in New Orleans, about an hour away, and somebody started talking about the movie Forrest Gump. "My favorite scene is when Ginny is getting on the bus and Forrest is watching her leave," I said. "I love that scene," Lisa said, "the one with the homemade sign, Berkeley or Bust." This was the moment we decided where exactly in California we were going. We had a destination, Berkeley. The original plan was to drive there in Elizabeth's parents' station wagon, but her dad flipped out when he found out his daughter was running off to Cali with some guy avoiding the police. Elizabeth was an adult, so he couldn't stop her from going, but he could stop her from using his car. We needed money, and I knew if I didn't get the ball rolling, the trip wouldn't happen. Lisa didn't have any money besides her last paycheck, and Elizabeth had an undisclosed amount in a savings account that was for emergency purposes only. I couldn't leave my future in the hands of two teenage girls, so I decided to sell my truck. I went to most of the low budget car dealerships in the area, but nobody offered me more than $500. The Edelbrook carburetor was worth more than that. I thought about taking it apart piece by piece and took a long walk back to my house to think it over. When I got there, I saw Joby had changed the locks, put all my stuff in the trash, and taped a note on the door that said, "Fuck off, Greg." Joby was pissed I didn't tell him about my upcoming trip to Cali, and when he found out, he felt betrayed. He told the neighbors she didn't want anything to do with me or my two new female friends. Joby was protecting his ego. Lisa and Elizabeth didn't like him from the start. They refused to even acknowledge the guy. I at least gave him a chance, but the girls didn't bother. He was from a different neighborhood than they were, dressed and spoke in a way that was unfamiliar, and had a personality most white kids are scared of. I didn't get pissed at Joey for kicking me out. It felt kind of relieving. I didn't have anywhere to sleep that night, but I still felt pretty good about my future. Nothing could bring me down. Joby didn't have to put all my stuff in the trash, but sometimes a man has to make a point. I had no money or anywhere. I had nowhere to go, so I felt like I had to. I had no money and nowhere to go, so I felt like I had to sell my truck. I went back to the dealership before they closed and gave them the keys and the title. When I got back to the apartment, I sat on the stoop with $500 in cash. I was waiting for Lisa to get home, but Javier got back first. He asked if I wanted to come inside, but I told him I'd rather wait out front for his girlfriend. When she finally got back, I told her I sold my truck and she went silent. Lisa always said she hated my truck. She complained about being seen in it. But from the look on her face, I realized she didn't hate it at all. My truck was gone and Elizabeth's father had taken her car. It looked like the only way we were going to California was with a long bus ride. None of us were looking forward to that, and some of the romance I painted for the trip started to drip away. We stalled in buying our tickets. I suggested we try hitchhiking. Lisa was down, but Elizabeth refused. Michael called the day before we bought our Greyhound tickets. He said he needed to talk, and I had a feeling what he was getting at, so I asked Lisa and Elizabeth to come with me to his place. He was staying at Janet and Jonathan's house, working at a pizza place nearby. During the drive there, I let the girls know that Michael had a completely ready and capable vehicle that could get us to California. I told them how we'd driven to Las Vegas for New Year's Eve a year and a half earlier. He'd be down to go on a road trip, I told them. When we got there, Michael immediately laid out his proposition for me and the girls. He'd recently been fired from his pizza delivering job and had some free time. He said he needed a vacation more than anyone and suggested that instead of us forking over a lot of money for bus tickets, we could just pay him to drive us to California in his small car. He said he'd be our personal chauffeur and take us wherever we wanted to go. The only thing he'd ask for in return was that we'd support his weed and cigarette habits for the duration of the trip. Michael made a good argument. He said we wouldn't have to sit on a crowded bus with strangers. We could chill in his Geo, smoke pot, and play our music as loud as we want. You'd have more control, he said. I told Michael to give us a minute, so he left the three of us alone in his room. Lisa and Elizabeth knew what I wanted to do, but they wanted more information about my twin brother. I told them as many positive things I could think of. He won't leave us on the side of the road. Lisa thought it was a good idea. If Greg says we can trust him, we should trust him, she said. Elizabeth wasn't so sure. He's not going to beat me up if I don't buy him his cigarettes and weed, is he? She nervously asked. He's the nicest guy in the world. And safe. I exaggerated my brother's kindness for the sake of the trip. The girls should have known what they were getting into, because 5 minutes later, Michael and I got in a fist fight in Janet's front yard. We exchanged a few blows and eventually got a hold of ourselves. Things calmed down, and I suggested the four of us go for a drive to test out the car. But 10 minutes later, we were fighting again, this time in a moving vehicle. A fountain drink got tossed all around and sticky pink liquid spilt on everyone. Michael pulled over and we got out and punched each other in the face a little more. The girls broke it up and Lisa demanded to sit in the front seat next to Michael. I sat in the back with Elizabeth. Despite this precursor to doom, Lisa and Elizabeth agreed to let Michael drive us to California. None of us had been there before, and nobody really knew why we were going. I pretended like I was on the run, but that was mainly for dramatic effect. It was the first summer of the next 1,000 years, and 4 kids were off to find themselves. That was from Gregory Brandt's wonderful book, Homeless College Student. That was chapter 3, where Gregory, the main character, and his twin brother Michael are about to set off on a trip to California with 2 lovely girls, Lisa and Elizabeth. If you enjoyed that, this book is available on Amazon and Kindle. You can also find it not only under Homeless College Student, but also under Gonzo Education. If you watch that whole video, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, hit the subscribe button, and thanks for watching. Check out all the videos and my other channels too.